So I'm going to tell you about this book principally in terms of the first and last chapter, and then the second and third chapters. The first chapter is a long essay on the necessity of violence. This was the headline. He's saying that the non-Western world will only achieve its freedom by means of violence. And this, of course, was the aspect of the book that was most offensive to Western readers. And it was the basic problem that Sartre's introduction is aimed at solving. You know, that how can I persuade people to read this book when the guy says what we need to do is blow up Europeans? So this of course is the most famous aspect of the book, that this guy, you know, says we've got to use violence to get, you know, progressive revolutionary change. The last chapter is a series of case records of his experience as a psychiatrist, drawn from across the social spectrum, from the French side to the Algerian side. And the main conclusion of this chapter is directly in conflict with the conclusion of the first, because he's saying basically that this violence that people are now involved in destroys everybody. It destroys human personality. And some of the most moving descriptions are his treatment of French soldiers who can't sleep at night because of their memories of what they perpetrated. The main argument of this chapter is that violence hurts not only the victims, but also the victimizers. And in fact, there is no human way out of this. So that's, an interesting juxtaposition, the bookends, if you like, of the argument. The central chapters are chapter 2 and chapter 3. Chapter 2 is a class analysis of where the anti-colonial revolution came from in class terms, which requires him to provide a class analysis of colonial society. And not just colonial society as it was in its heyday, but colonial society as it began to decline and as resistance began to escalate. And you know, I won't try to reproduce for you this analysis, but I mean, he starts out by saying, well, you know, you have the colonial ruling class, and then you have the chiefs who live in the countryside and who essentially administer the rural populations on behalf of the colonial regime, and who are broadly conservative. And then you have the urban classes, which includes a small proletariat, people who work for capital, people who work in government administration. It involves the educated class, many of whom have traveled overseas to be educated in Paris and so on. And it involves, you know, a large sector of urban street traders and petty entrepreneurs and so forth. And he describes the insularity of the urban populations. And then he talks about how the crackdown of the colonial authorities against insurgents, or even against political resistance in a passive form, leads people from these urban intellectuals, if you like, who formed the beginning of the anti-colonial revolution. It leads them to go and take hiding in the countryside, where they join up with the peasants and discover, probably for the first time in their lives, what the rural people, how they experience. And they don't just, as it were, become organic intellectuals who draw inspiration and energy from their association from the peasants, but they actually learn what it means to be a peasant in a colonial society, and they and learn from from the peasants, a vision which eventually allows them to mobilize the peasantry in a rural and urban insurrection against colonial rule. So that's a very brief sketch of where the colonial revolution comes from in social class terms. It's extremely brilliant, I think, very economical. But the most important chapter is the third, it's called, oh God, I've forgotten what it's called. It's because I've been lecturing for too long, and I've got a hangover anyway. And so you know, I'm operating with about a third of the normal level of batteries. But it's called the pitfall. See, that allowed me to remember it. It's called the pitfalls of national consciousness. And this is a guy writing in 1959, before most places in Africa, north or middle or south, had acquired independence. And he says that if the revolution, the anti-colonial revolution, takes the form of nation states, we're lost, basically. And he predicts that the anti-colonial revolution will take and is taking a national form, and that this national form is inadequate to the task of post-independence. And what you've got to understand is that in the first half of the 20th century, there was a Pan-African movement. James himself was a major player in that. This was an alliance between black people in Africa and the descendants of the slave diaspora in the New World, and Africans and people of African descent in most of the European countries as well as in America and so on. And Pan-Africanism gave ideological unity to this very disparate set of populations. And the basic idea of Pan-Africanism is that Africa should belong to Africans. It was really a sort of nationalist movement on a grand scale. But as long as Africa was owned by colonial imperial powers, then it was they could unite around the notion that all black people should come together against white rule. And so, although it was a nationalist movement, it united a broader spectrum of people from around the world than any other political movements of its day.